Americans. We will have something in a different form. Trump told reporters as he toured a Honeywell mask manufacturing plant, in which he was wearing safety goggles, but he was not wearing a mask. The president praised the work of the task force led by Vice President Mike Pence, but said it was time to focus on safety in reopening the country. Trying to at least reopen the country in some way safely and forcing people back to work. I mean, the really kind of crazy thing, and the thing that I think people aren't really realizing about these protesters is they're not people who are dying to get back to work. They're not people who are coming out there and being... they're not desperate to feed their families, because the people who are desperate to feed their families are currently on food banks that are miles and miles long, and are currently trying to desperately file for unemployment to make their payments each month, and just keep themselves and their families alive. These people who are out there hooting and hollering like little piggies in front of various state departments are the same type of people who thought it was a great idea to parade down a Florida river or whatever in the direction of Mar-a-Lago in hundreds and hundreds of boats in celebration of President Trump. They're people who are very comfortable and that they've lived with that comfort all their lives, and they cannot fathom that comfort being taken away from them. They just can't. They can't have this idea of their quality of life being lessened in any way. There's protesters who say, I can't go to Baskin Robbins, give me your liberty or give me death. Literally putting their lives and their families' lives and other people's lives on the line to stuff their faces at American fast food joints every single day. There's a person who very hilariously said, I have to ask for 2 iced teas on the drive-thru. I can't get free refills in the store. That is where the heads are at of these people who are protesting. And the good thing is they're not at all a high representation of the country. They're a very, very small representation of the country. Those people and people who own much larger companies at a much higher scale are also desperate to get back to work. And the richest among us, as we talked about in the last episode, are continuing to accumulate money in the pandemic, profiting off the pandemic. And as the poorest among us are going to be the ones who are A, forced to go back to work, and B, who are risking themselves in this way. So really what this calls for is high taxes on the rich, obviously, as the situation even before this called for. But yeah, that's a little bit of digression. But news of the winding down the task force came as the rate of new infections and deaths was falling in New York, but was continuing to rise in much of the rest of the country. If you're living in New York, as I am, it's obviously a relief. But we had, thanks to I think New Rochelle, really, in New York City, we pretty much had most of and it's literally just in one tip of New York, is where pretty much most of the activity happens. But the bottom right-hand corner of New York is where New York City is, Long Island is, pretty much most of the population is. They've really been ravaged the most by coronavirus, most in the world. Probably the biggest hot spot of corona right now. They're the people who've been ravaged, and now finally that's coming down. But a number of projections, though, in other states suggest that deaths will remain at elevated levels for months and are likely to increase as states ease their stay-at-home orders. And to put it in perspective here, the lockdowns have not been that bad. I've been able to, today, I was going on bike rides that were, very, very far away from my home. In places like Italy, places like Spain, you're not allowed to go 100 meters from your home without a mask. You're not you're only allowed to go to the food store twice a week. It is very, very restrictive. It's incredibly restrictive, way more restrictive than other countries, and that's a big part of why they probably had so many deaths or so few deaths. And we are just failing in every single way at this. Still, Trump really did seem eager to move past the pandemic. On Tuesday, he ventured beyond the Mid-Atlantic for the first time in more than 2 months, the Mid-Atlantic region, as he went to Arizona to tour that mask factory. He used an official appearance at an Arizona factory as the latest show of support for returning to normal life. In heavily political remarks after a tour of the facility, the president said that our country is now in the stage of the battle against the virus, in the next stage of the battle against the virus, and we are now, quote, reopening the country. Trump also boasted of his 2016 election victory in the state, called for the full truth about the China situation, and gave the microphone to 2 local campaign supporters. So, yes, very heavily political. Here's a good one. We love to see this, folks, don't we? As the federal government's warehouses were running bare and medical workers were improvising with their own safety gear, the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, placed a team of young volunteers with no procurement experience on the front lines of the administration's supply chain task force. The volunteers were told to prioritize tips from political allies and associates of President Trump, tracked on a spreadsheet called VIP Update, according to documents and emails obtained by the New York Times. So pretty much what they're doing is prioritizing these people who had been friendly to Trump to and trusting them to take care of the lives of Americans. Prioritized tips from political allies and associates is the phrasing used by the Times here. Among them were leads from Republican members of Congress, the Trump youth activist Charlie Kirk, a former Apprentice contestant who serves as the campaign chair of Women for Trump. Few of the leads, VIP or otherwise, panned out, according to the whistleblower memo written by one volunteer and sent to the House Oversight Committee. Federal officials who spent years devising emergency plans were layered over by Kushner's allies, who believe the private sector experience could solve the country's looming supply shortage. The young volunteers who came from venture capital and private equity firms, probably the most evil professions you can have in this country, right up there with murder. The young volunteers, they had the know-how to quickly weed out good leads. That's what they thought, anyway. They had the know-how to quickly weed out good leads from bad ones. And FEMA and other agencies, though, said they were not. They said that FEMA and other agencies were not equipped for the task. They wouldn't be able to get the job done. But at least one tip the volunteers forwarded turned out to be an expensive debacle. In late March, according to emails obtained by the Times, 2 of the volunteers passed along procurement forms submitted by Yaron Oren Pines, a Silicon Valley engineer who said he could provide more than 1,000 ventilators at a time when ventilators were desperately needed, especially by New York. Federal officials then sent the tips to New York, who assumed that Oren Pines had been vetted and awarded him an eye-popping $69 million contract. Not a single ventilator was delivered. All I got to say to that is nice, awesome, cool, great. Yeah, we love to see it, folks. The nature and scale of a response seemed grossly inadequate, said a volunteer, who, like the others, signed a non-disclosure agreement and spoke only on the condition of anonymity. It was a bureaucratic cycle of chaos, but this is just a bureaucratic cycle of just complete incompetence. As Americans died, like literally, it's not inconceivable that they win in 2020. These people, but they really don't deserve to. Like any competent campaign would have Donald Trump 20 points underwater in every single poll right now. Like any competent 25 plus. Like this should be a major story if Joe Biden could get out of the basement and start actually talking about things that mattered. Like, this is just such a joke. Like, this guy, he awarded 69 in the height, because I remember back in March, it wasn't that long ago, people, like, Andrew Cuomo was, like, out there, please, can we please have ventilators? Like, that's all he was talking about. Ventilators, every single day with this PowerPoint presentation. We need ventilators, please. We're going to run out of ventilators. Our hospitals are going to be overwhelmed. Like, a lot of people who are paying any attention to New York news at the time will probably remember this. $69 million the federal government paid this guy. $69 million, and not a single ventilator was delivered. Not one. Like, this should be a huge, every American should know about this scandal. It's ridiculous that they don't. It's a complete failure, not just Joe Biden's campaign, but the entire Democratic Party. It's just that simple. So, we can now, here's the coronavirus pandemic cuts through the country. It's leaving behind large numbers of deaths that surpass those of recent history. A New York Times analysis of state data from the CDC begins to offer a picture of just how many lives have been lost, both as the result of coronavirus and the fears of using an overwhelmed healthcare system. Like, I mean, anytime, I'm sure you probably heard this if you have, like, you live with like other kids in the house, if you have kids in the house that get into fights, like your parents say, we don't want to go to the hospital. We don't want to go to the hospital. Like the hospital's pretty stressed out right now. And it makes sense, right? Because it is pretty bad. A handful of states account for the bulk of the death surge across the United States. In New York City, for example, since mid-March, there have been 23,000 more deaths than normal. In Illinois, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, they've also seen more than 1,000 deaths more than usual figure between March 15th and April 11th. In a larger group of states, including California, Florida, and Texas, the increase in deaths were more modest during the early phase of the pandemic, but the death rates are still higher than normal. In other states, including Iowa, Kentucky, and Missouri, deaths are actually below the expected trend. By the way, Missouri is saying concerts can resume soon. That may be because of lags in data reporting, but also could be because that stay-at-home orders have lowered the death rates from those caused by car crashes or the flu. So that is interesting. Yeah, that's a little piece of information now. But also, we do see another report. A federal scientist says he was pressured to steer clear of contracts to clients of a well-connected consultant. So more evidence of really just these awful mismanagement and just cronyism by the people in charge of this in the federal government level, and just people being like you got to get it to our friends. Like the corruption that's going to come out after this, like after we stop reporting on a bunch of people dying every day, it's going to be so bad. Like I don't know how much people realize that it's going to be so bad. Also, an Amazon worker of Staten Island dies of coronavirus complications. And outbreaks have been shuttering meat packing plants. Meat is now getting scarcer in grocery aisles and drive-thrus. And the Wisconsin top court sounds really pretty skeptical of the state's stay-at-home order. As they continue, Wisconsin's state court has really been quite on one recently with sending voters out to die. But yeah, there's that. So that's pretty much all the coronavirus news I can take for now. We're going to move on to Ayanna Pressley. Some good news. Representative Ayanna Pressley, she drew a lot of praise on Monday for a blog post addressing the sexual assault allegations against presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden and calling for a necessary conversation about true survivor justice. And it really is, it really is kind of crazy that we've seen not a word from Bernie Sanders on this. He should be, I think, speaking about this a lot more openly. He should be, at least thinking about starting his campaign up again, because there's a really good chance, like, Joe Biden might get in serious trouble. Like, he's now below what Hillary Clinton was polling at this time in 2016, so it's definitely not comforting in any way. But Representative Pressley, she drew a lot of praise. She called for a response to Biden that models the empathy, diligence, and acknowledgement of broken systems that this conversation demands. The Medium post was written by Pressley. She did endorse Elizabeth Warren, but she refers not only to Biden's 1993 assault of former Senate, or alleged assault, I guess you could say, assault of former Senate aide Tara Reid, but also of survivors, the hopes of survivors and marginalized people from all walks of life. The essay eyes the current political moment as a possible turning point for inching the nation closer to reconciling our history of structural violence and oppression, and notes that Pressley is herself a survivor, probably really why this is resonating so much with her. I'd have to think. She wrote, quote, "We are in the throes of an election of the greatest consequence, one that will determine if core rights and tenets of democracy survive in this nation. The stakes cannot be overstated, but I have no patience for any person who tells me that is not a reason to lower my voice. I reject the false choice that my party and our nominee can't address the allegations at hand and defeat the occupant of the White House. It will take discipline and courage, but survivors and marginalized people from all walks of life are watching, wondering if this time the conversation might actually change. So I'm here to ask the Biden campaign and the nominee to give a response that models the empathy, diligence, and acknowledgement of broken systems that this conversation demands. I'm asking for true partnership with survivors, advocates, and for policy commitments that gets us closer as a nation to reconciling our history of structural violence and oppression." So yeah, shout out to her for really actually doing this in a very, very